when the battered old woman grabbed the orphan bride's hand and whispered, "Run, do not marry my son." She had no idea this terrifying secret would lead her straight into the arms of the continent's most powerful, disguised billionaire. At just 21 years old, Nneka faced unimaginable adversity after losing both parents in a devastating road accident, a tragedy that thrust her into a life of extreme suffering and constant labor. The red earth of the village of Umueka felt cold beneath her bare feet as she carried a heavy basin of water from the stream for the 5th time that morning. Nneka had been raised by her aunt, a woman named Ikayet, whose heart was as hard as the dried mahogany bark used for firewood. Ikayet did not see a niece in Nneka. She saw a servant who did not require a salary, a ghost who only existed to serve. Life in the small, dilapidated cement house was a cycle of endless chores and sharp words that fell like whiplashes on Nneka's tired shoulders. She had learned to take up as little space as possible, moving through the shadows of the compound like a silent bird. But Nneka had everything except one thing: choice. Her destiny was decided on a humid Tuesday afternoon when a shiny black Mercedes-Benz drove into their dusty compound, kicking up clouds of orange sand. Out stepped Boniface, a man whose silk suit cost more than everything Ikayet had ever owned in her entire life. Boniface was known throughout the region as a successful businessman with interests in construction and logistics. He had a smile that was white and blinding, but it never seemed to reach his eyes, which remained as cold as a predator watching its prey. He had come to Umueke to find a wife, or, as the villagers whispered, to find a beautiful ornament to decorate his mansion in the city of Enugu. Ikayet practically bowed to the ground, her eyes gleaming with the greed of a woman who had finally found a golden ticket. Nneka was summoned from the kitchen, her hands still smelling of fermented cassava and wood smoke. She stood before the wealthy man, her head bowed in a show of traditional humility that Boniface mistook for simple obedience. He looked at her not with love, but with the calculated gaze of a merchant inspecting a new piece of furniture for his showroom. Something about the way he touched her chin made a shiver of pure ice run down Nneka's spine. He looked at Ikayet and spoke with a voice that was smooth like oil. "I will take her, and the bride price will be paid in full by tomorrow morning." Ikayet's joy was a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the quiet village, but for Nneka, it was the sound of a prison door closing. Little did she know, this small act of forced submission was only the beginning of a journey that would test every ounce of her soul. The negotiations were brief, and the money was exchanged in thick envelopes that disappeared into Ikayet's locked wooden chest. Nneka was given 1 hour to pack her few belongings into a small, torn traveling bag. The drive to Enugu was long and silent, the lush green forests of the east blurring past the window of the luxury car. Boniface did not speak to her. Instead, he spent the entire journey shouting into 2 different mobile phones about shipments and contracts. He treated her as if she were a piece of luggage he had placed in the back seat, a quiet cargo that required no conversation. They arrived at a massive estate, guarded by high walls topped with electric wires and shards of broken glass. The mansion was a monument to wealth, with white marble pillars and golden-rimmed windows that caught the late afternoon sun. But to Nneka, the house felt like a tomb, cold and vast and filled with secrets. Boniface led her past the main entrance and toward a small dark building at the back of the compound. "This is where you will stay until the wedding," he said, his voice now devoid of the charm he had shown in the village. "You are here to learn how to be the wife of a man of my caliber, and that means you must learn to listen." He left her there without a lamp or a blanket, the heavy metal door clicking shut with a finality that made her heart beat faster. The darkness of the small room was absolute, pressing against her skin until she felt she could not breathe. She sat on the cold floor, her tears rolling down her cheeks as she whispered the names of her late parents. "Where are you now?" she asked the silence. "Why have you left your only daughter in the den of a lion?" She fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with the scent of red earth and the sound of distant thunder. The next morning, the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn back, woke her before the sun had even risen. A young maid with a fearful expression stood in the doorway, holding a bucket of cold water and a worn piece of soap. "Master says you are to clean the back porch and then report to the kitchen for your instructions," the girl whispered before disappearing into the mist. Nneka realized then that she had not been brought here to be a queen, but to be a slave in a gilded cage. She spent the day scrubbing floors and polishing brass, her hands becoming raw and painful from the harsh chemicals. But what nobody could see was the quiet strength that held her together, a resilience she had inherited from a long line of brave women. It was during her lunch break, as she sat behind the kitchen with a bowl of plain rice, that she heard a strange, rhythmic thumping sound. It was coming from a small barred window at the very base of the main house, hidden behind a thick growth of hibiscus bushes. Curiosity, seasoned with a strange sense of dread, drew her toward the sound. She knelt in the dirt and peered through the rusted iron bars into a basement room that smelled of dampness and old medicine. Inside, an elderly woman sat on a wooden chair, her gray hair matted and her face thin from neglect. Her left arm was encased in a dirty white cast, and her eyes were wide with a terror that Nneka recognized all too well. The woman looked up and saw Nneka, her trembling hands reaching out toward the bars. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You must not stay here." Nneka was frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "I am his mother," the old woman replied, and the tears began to fall from her hollow eyes. "He did this to me because I dared to tell him that his heart was becoming as hard as stone. He will do the same to you, or worse, once the wedding ring is on your finger. Run, Nneka, run before the sun sets on your freedom." A lump formed in Nneka's throat as she looked at the battered woman who was supposed to be the matriarch of this grand house. If he could do this to the woman who gave him life, what would he do to an orphan with no family to protect her? She reached through the bars and touched the woman's cold, thin fingers. The words dropped like a stone into the quiet afternoon. "I have no money and nowhere to go," Nneka said, the weight of her helplessness crushing her spirit. The old woman looked at her with a sudden, sharp clarity. "Then you must find an ally where you least expect one," she said, "for God does not sleep when the innocent are in danger." Nneka heard the heavy footsteps of Boniface approaching and scrambled away from the window, her heart racing with the fear of discovery. She spent the rest of the day in a blur of terror. The image of the old woman's broken arm burned into her mind. Every time Boniface looked at her, she saw the predator beneath the silk suit. That evening, he summoned her to his study, a room filled with the scent of expensive leather and old brandy. He looked at her and asked the question that had been forming in his mind. "Are you ready to become Mrs. Boniface?" Nneka looked at the floor, her voice trembling as she gave the answer she knew he wanted to hear. The words left her lips so softly, yet they echoed loudly in her mind. There was no taking it back now. She had entered into a contract with a monster, and the wedding was only 7 days away. Little did she know, the storm was already among them, and the first lightning strike was about to hit. As the days bled into one another, Nneka settled into a rhythm of absolute exhaustion. The massive compound, with its gleaming marble and towering pillars, became her personal purgatory. Boniface did not want a wife to cherish. He wanted a showpiece, who also knew how to scrub the dirt from his expensive imported tiles. The wedding was only days away, and he had invited the wealthiest men from across the country to witness his triumph. To prepare for the feast, he handed Nneka a long list of provisions and ordered her to handle the purchasing and the cooking herself, claiming it was the traditional duty of a good bride to prove her worth to her husband's guests. The next morning, Nneka woke before the sun. The air was still thick with the humid weight of the night as she walked to Ogbete main market, her bare feet carrying her over the cracked pavement of the city streets. The market was a living, breathing beast. The cacophony of voices, the blaring horns of the overloaded transport buses, and the heavy scent of dried fish mingling with the sharp aroma of fresh palm oil assaulted her senses. She carried a wide woven basket on her head, her neck aching under the strain as she navigated through the tight, muddy pathways between the wooden stalls. She bargained for bags of rice, heavy tubers of yam, and baskets of fiery red peppers, every vendor looking at her worn clothes and assuming she was just another poor housemaid sent on a wealthy master's errand. She was invisible, but not in a good way. She was simply another tired soul swallowed by the relentless machinery of the city. By midday, the heat was unbearable, beating down on the corrugated iron roofs of the market and turning the air into a stifling oven. Nneka sat on a discarded wooden crate near the edge of the market to catch her breath. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow, painful reminder that she had not eaten since the meager portion of plain rice the day before. From the deep pocket of her faded wrapper, she pulled out a small piece of roasted plantain she had managed to save from the kitchen scraps. It was barely enough to fill the palm of her hand, but it was all she had. Just as she was about to take a bite, a low, wretched coughing sound drew her attention. A few feet away, sitting in the mud near a pile of rotting cabbage leaves, was a man. He was covered in dirt so thick it masked the features of his face. His clothes were nothing more than rags hanging off a seemingly frail frame, and one of his legs was twisted at a painful, unnatural angle. A cracked wooden bowl sat empty between his calloused hands. The crowd moved around him like water around a stone, some people stepping over him, others deliberately kicking dust in his direction. Nneka watched as a wealthy merchant in a flowing lace garment walked past, holding a scented handkerchief to his nose. The merchant looked at the beggar with profound disgust and muttered a harsh insult, telling the crippled man that he was nothing but a curse upon the earth and that he should crawl away into the gutters where he belonged. The words hit Nneka like a slap across the face. She knew that pain. She knew what it felt like to be looked at as if she were dirt beneath someone's expensive shoes. Tears rolled down her cheeks, mixing with the sweat and the dust of the market. She looked at her small piece of roasted plantain, the only sustenance she had for the long walk back to the estate. And then she looked at the beggar. His head was bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly, as if he had absorbed the wealthy man's cruelty deep into his bones. Without a second thought, Nneka stood up and walked over to the crippled man. She knelt in the mud beside him, ignoring the flies and the stench of the garbage heap. She broke her small piece of plantain perfectly in half. She placed the larger half gently into his cracked wooden bowl. The beggar slowly lifted his head. Beneath the grime and the matted hair, his eyes were a striking, piercing brown, entirely too sharp and clear for a man broken by the streets. He looked at the food, then at the young woman in the torn dress, whose face was stained with quiet sorrow. He looked at her carefully and asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he watched her sit down with her heavy basket. Why do you give away your only food when your own stomach cries out from hunger? The words left his lips with a strange, quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with his wretched appearance. Nneka offered a sad, exhausted smile, a smile that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights and too many shed tears. She looked at the muddy ground and answered him, her voice trembling but sincere. She told him that the pain of an empty stomach was terrible, but the pain of a forgotten soul was much worse, and that no one, no matter how poor or broken, deserved to feel completely invisible in the eyes of God. The words left her lips so softly, yet they echoed loudly in his mind. Obina, the billionaire heir to the Zenith Global Industries empire, sat frozen beneath his beggar's disguise. For 6 months, he had roamed the streets of Enugu, dressed as a crippled outcast. He had inherited wealth beyond imagination, an investment portfolio that controlled shipping lines and construction firms across the continent, but his father's dying words had haunted him. His father had warned him that money attracted vultures disguised as doves, and that he must find a woman whose heart was pure gold, not one whose eyes only saw gold. Obina had been spat on, cursed at, and ignored by hundreds of beautiful, well-dressed women. Yet here was a girl with nothing, a girl who looked like she carried the weight of the world on her fragile shoulders, offering him her last bite of food. Little did she know, this small act of kindness would change her life forever. But for now, the storm was still brewing. Nneka returned to the estate late in the afternoon, her body trembling with fatigue. Boniface was waiting for her on the marble porch, his arms crossed over his silk shirt. He inspected the baskets of food with a critical eye, finding fault with the size of the yams and the color of the peppers. He berated her in front of the gate guards, calling her a useless village girl who did not know the value of a single naira. He ordered her to take the supplies to the kitchen and begin preparing the stews for the pre-wedding gathering that evening, forbidding her from resting until every pot was full. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Nneka stood over the massive iron pots, stirring the thick palm nut soup. The heat from the firewood cracked against her skin, and her arms ached so deeply she felt they might snap. As she worked, her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the gentle voice of her mother singing as she braided Nneka's hair on the porch of their village home. Her mother had always told her that character was like smoke. No matter how hard you tried to hide it, it would eventually reveal itself to the world. A lump formed in her throat as she realized how desperately she missed the feeling of being loved, of being safe. Now, she was trapped in a beautiful prison, counting down the days until she was permanently bound to a man whose soul was as dark as a starless night. Later that evening, as the last light faded from the sky, and the sounds of Boniface and his wealthy friends drinking imported brandy echoed from the main house, Nneka managed to sneak a small plate of rice and fish out the back door. She crept through the shadows of the hibiscus bushes until she reached the small, barred window at the base of the house. The old woman was there, waiting in the gloom. Nneka pushed the plate carefully through the rusty bars. "You must eat, Mama," she whispered, her heart beating faster at the thought of being caught. The old woman took the food with her good hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked at the young girl who was risking a severe beating just to feed a forgotten prisoner. She touched Nneka's fingers through the iron grate and spoke with a terrifying certainty. She told Nneka that the wedding must not happen, that Boniface was planning to use her signature to secure a massive land deal in her home village. And once he had the land, he would dispose of her just as he had disposed of the women before her. The words dropped like a stone into Nneka's chest. The reality of her situation tightened around her neck like a noose. She had no family to turn to, no money to flee, and the local police were all securely inside Boniface's deep pockets. If she ran, his men would catch her before she reached the city limits. The next morning, Nneka was sent back to Ogbede main market to buy fresh meat. The routine repeated itself. The crushing heat, the heavy loads, the indifferent crowds. When she reached the edge of the market, her eyes instinctively searched the mud near the garbage heap. The crippled beggar was there. This time, Nneka did not just give him her leftover food. She brought him a small, clean calabash filled with cool drinking water. Obinna took the calabash, his sharp brown eyes studying her face. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the fresh, purple bruise on her wrist where Boniface had grabbed her too tightly the night before. His jaw clenched beneath his fake beard. He wanted to stand up, to wipe the dirt from his face, to call his fleet of luxury vehicles and take her far away from whoever was causing her such pain. But the test was not yet complete. He needed to see the full measure of her spirit, and he needed to uncover the identity of the monster who dared to place bruises on the skin of such a gentle soul. He drank the water and lowered the calabash, his voice rumbling like distant thunder as he spoke. He told her that tears were not a sign of weakness, but a sign that the heart was still fighting to remain soft in a hard world. And he asked her who had put the dark mark upon her delicate skin. Nneka quickly pulled her sleeve down over her wrist, her eyes darting away in shame. She looked at the beggar and spoke softly, her voice barely rising above the noise of the market. She told him that some storms could not be outrun, that they simply had to be endured until the rain stopped falling, and she turned away before he could see the fresh tears gathering in her eyes. As she walked away, balancing the heavy basket of meat on her head, Obina watched her disappear into the crowd. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning. The disguised billionaire had found his queen, but before he could crown her, he would have to tear down the empire of the man who was keeping her captive. The wedding was only 5 days away, and the true gathering storm was about to break. As the days ticked down toward the dreaded wedding ceremony, the atmosphere inside the sprawling Enugu estate grew thick with a suffocating tension. The countdown had begun, and with it, the mask that Boniface wore for the outside world began to slip completely in the privacy of his own home. The first major storm broke on a rainy Tuesday morning, just 3 days before the ceremony. Nneka had woken up before the roosters even thought to crow, her bones aching from the damp cold that seeped through the thin mat on her floor. She had managed to smuggle a small portion of leftover yam porridge out of the kitchen, carefully navigating the slippery marble corridors to reach the small barred window where the old woman was kept. Just as Nneka was pushing the wrapped leaves through the iron grate, a harsh voice shattered the quiet morning like a pane of breaking glass. Boniface stood at the edge of the hibiscus bushes, his silk pajamas completely incongruous with the pure malice twisting his handsome features. He marched forward, his heavy leather slippers slapping against the wet concrete, and snatched the food from Nneka's trembling hands. He threw the porridge into the mud, grinding his heel into the soft yams until nothing remained but dirt. He looked at Nneka, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits, and unleashed a torrent of verbal poison that made her stomach violently turn. He told her that she was nothing but a starving rat who had sneaked into his palace, a useless village burden who dared to steal from his table to feed an old witch who had outlived her usefulness. When the old woman behind the bars began to weep and beg for him to spare the girl, Boniface's rage boiled over. He reached through the bars and slapped his own mother across the face, the sound echoing sharply against the damp walls. Nneka gasped and threw her body against the iron grate, desperately trying to shield the battered woman from her son's wrath. Boniface grabbed Nneka by the hair, pulling her backward so forcefully that she fell hard onto the wet stones, scraping her elbows until they bled. He warned her that if she ever came near the basement again, he would ensure she joined the old woman in the dark permanently. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she lay in the cold mud, watching him walk back to the warmth of his mansion. She did not cry for the pain in her bleeding arms, but for the profound darkness of a man who could strike the woman who had carried him in her womb. For hours afterward, as she scrubbed the massive cooking pots in the kitchen, her mind descended into a deep, agonizing reflection. She remembered a time when she was just a little girl in the village, sitting on the strong shoulders of her father as they walked back from their cassava farm. The sun had been setting, casting a warm golden glow over the green hills, and her father had told her that a man's true strength was not measured by how heavy a load he could lift, but by how gently he held the fragile things in his life. Her heart began beating faster as panic set in. How had she ended up here, entirely at the mercy of a man who destroyed everything he touched? She closed her eyes, the scent of wood smoke bringing back the memory of her mother's soft hands. Her mother had always taught her that enduring hardship with grace was the mark of a royal spirit, but surely God did not expect her to endure this level of cruelty. She felt like a bird trapped in a cage with a serpent, waiting for the inevitable strike. What nobody could see was the quiet strength that held her together, a deep, ancestral resilience that refused to be completely broken. The very next day, the cycle of humiliation repeated itself, moving from the private shadows of the estate to the glaring public light of Ogbete Main Market. Boniface had insisted on accompanying Nneka to purchase the final, expensive ingredients for the pre-wedding feast, wanting to parade his beautiful, submissive bride before the local merchants to feed his own vanity. He walked 3 steps ahead of her, dressed in a crisp, white traditional outfit, while Nneka struggled behind him, balancing heavy woven baskets and wearing a faded dress that marked her clear inferiority. As they passed the crowded garbage heap near the edge of the market, Nneka's eyes instantly searched for the crippled beggar. Obina was there, sitting in the dust, his sharp brown eyes tracking their approach. Nneka's pace slowed unconsciously, her hand instinctively reaching into her pocket where she had hidden a small, clean piece of bread for him. But Boniface, with the hyper-vigilance of a controlling tyrant, noticed her hesitation. He followed her gaze to the filthy man on the ground, and his lips curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. Before Nneka could stop him, Boniface stepped forward and violently kicked the beggar's cracked wooden bowl, sending the few meager coins inside, scattering into the muddy gutter. The crowd gasped, but Boniface only laughed, his voice loud and booming for everyone to hear. He turned to Nneka, pointing a manicured finger at her face, and shouted his insults so the entire market could bear witness. He declared that a pig would always recognize its own kind, that no matter how much money he spent to wash the village dirt off her skin, her soul would always belong in the gutter with the rest of the filthy animals. The words hit her like a slap across the face. The bustling market fell into a suffocating silence as hundreds of eyes turned to stare at the wealthy man humiliating the poor girl. Nneka stood frozen, a lump forming in her throat so thick she could barely draw breath. Her hands trembled as she looked down at the beggar, her heart breaking for the innocent man who had been dragged into her nightmare. Obina sat perfectly still in the dirt. He did not reach for his scattered coins. Instead, his piercing eyes locked onto Boniface's face, memorizing every contour of the man's arrogant expression. He looked at Boniface and spoke in a voice that was eerily calm, stating that a man who kicked a fallen stranger was only revealing how terrified he was of his own eventual fall. Boniface's face flushed with violent anger. He raised his walking stick to strike the beggar, but a murmur of disapproval from the surrounding crowd made him hesitate. Instead, he grabbed Nneka violently by the arm, his fingernails digging painfully into her flesh, and dragged her away, leaving the beggar behind in the dust. As she was pulled through the chaotic streets, Nneka retreated deep into her own mind, her internal monologue a chaotic storm of grief and shame. She felt entirely stripped of her dignity, exposed and ridiculed before strangers. She wondered if her aunt Nneka knew what kind of monster she had sold her to. Success reveals character. It does not change it, she thought bitterly, remembering an old proverb the village elders used to recite under the moonlight. Boniface's wealth had only magnified the darkness in his soul. Yet, even in her despair, her thoughts drifted back to the beggar. There had been no fear in his eyes when Boniface raised the stick. There had only been a quiet, terrifying certainty. Who was that man, she wondered, and why did his steady gaze make her feel as though she was not entirely alone in the world? Meanwhile, back in the dirt of the market, Obina waited until the crowd dispersed. He slowly reached beneath his ragged robes and pulled out a sleek, top-tier satellite phone. He dialed a private number, his voice dropping its raspy disguise and returning to the crisp, authoritative tone of a chief executive officer. He ordered his legal team to freeze every asset, cancel every contract, and investigate every shadow connected to Boniface's logistics company, promising that by the end of the week, the arrogant tyrant would not even own the clothes on his back. But the ultimate test of Nneka's spirit occurred on the eve of the wedding. Boniface hosted a massive, lavish gala at his mansion to celebrate his impending marriage. The sprawling lawns were decorated with imported fairy lights, expensive crystal centerpieces, and tables groaning under the weight of exotic foods and expensive champagnes. The elite of Enugu were all in attendance, businessmen in tailored suits and socialites in sparkling gowns, laughing and drinking under the clear night sky. Nneka was not allowed to sit with the guests. Instead, Boniface forced her to wear a plain, ill-fitting maid's uniform and ordered her to serve drinks to the very people she was supposed to call her peers the next day. He wanted to break her spirit completely before putting a ring on her finger, to ensure she never forgot that her elevation was entirely dependent on his mercy. For hours, she walked among the tables, her feet swollen and her back aching, enduring the sneers and condescending whispers of the wealthy guests who found it highly amusing that a millionaire was making his bride work as a common servant. The climax of the humiliation arrived just before midnight. Boniface, thoroughly intoxicated on imported whiskey and high on the adoration of his peers, decided that the entertainment was not quite complete. He ordered 2 of his guards to go down to the basement. Minutes later, they dragged his elderly, battered mother out onto the illuminated lawn. The old woman blinked against the harsh lights, her broken arm clutched to her chest, her thin frame shivering in the cool night breeze. The music abruptly stopped. The guests fell silent. Boniface stood on the grand marble staircase, holding a glass of champagne, and proudly announced to the crowd that this was what happened to anyone who dared to question his authority in his own house, even the woman who birthed him. He ordered his mother to get on her knees and apologize to his guests for being an eyesore. Nneka's vision blurred with angry, hot tears. The sheer injustice of the moment burned through her veins like a consuming fire. She dropped the heavy silver tray of champagne glasses she was carrying. The crystal shattered loudly against the stone patio, drawing everyone's attention. Ignoring Boniface's immediate shout of rage, Nneka rushed forward and wrapped her arms around the trembling old woman, shielding her from the cruel stares of the crowd. Boniface marched down the stairs, his face contorted with fury. He grabbed Nneka by the shoulder and threw her to the ground beside his mother. He looked down at the 2 broken women and laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound. He raised his voice and told the crowd that a useless orphan and a useless hag belonged together in the dirt. At that exact moment, a commotion broke out near the heavy iron gates of the estate. The security guards were shouting, pushing back a figure who had managed to slip past the outer perimeter. It was the crippled beggar from the market, still dressed in rags, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. He stood just inside the glow of the fairy lights, his sharp eyes fixed on the scene unfolding on the lawn. Boniface saw him and burst into fresh, hysterical laughter. He pointed at the beggar, mocking him loudly. He told Nneka that her Prince Charming had finally arrived, a filthy, broken piece of trash coming to rescue another piece of trash. He ordered his guards to beat the beggar and throw him into the nearest gutter, demanding that his property be cleansed of such disgusting filth. As the guards moved forward with their batons raised, Nneka looked at the beggar, tears rolling down her cheeks. She was terrified for him. Yet she noticed that he did not flinch, he did not cower, he simply stood his ground like a mountain refusing to bow to the wind. Little did she know, the testing phase was finally over. The masquerade was coming to an end. As she held the old woman tightly in her arms on the cold stone floor, Nneka made a silent, dangerous vow. Tomorrow was the wedding day. Tomorrow, the entire city would be in the grand cathedral. And tomorrow she would expose this monster to the world, even if it cost her her very life. The next morning, the sun rose over the city of Enugu, casting a brilliant golden glow through the massive stained glass windows of the grand cathedral. The sanctuary was packed from wall to wall with the wealthiest elites, politicians, and business moguls from across the country. They sat in polished wooden pews, wearing expensive imported laces and tailored silk suits, waiting to witness the union of the season. Boniface stood at the altar, looking like a triumphant prince. He wore a perfectly tailored white tuxedo, his chest puffed out with pride, his blinding fake smile firmly in place. He was ready to seal his image as a respectable family man, unaware that his empire of lies was about to collapse. The massive pipe organ began to play the traditional wedding march. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the cathedral slowly swung open. The guests turned their heads, expecting to see a bride dripping in expensive white silk and sparkling diamonds. Instead, the entire congregation gasped in collective shock. Nneka walked down the long red carpeted aisle. She was not wearing a wedding gown. She was wearing the exact same faded, torn dress she had worn on the day she arrived from the village. Her bare feet stepped softly against the plush carpet, but she was not alone. With her right hand, she tightly held the good hand of Boniface's elderly mother. The old woman shuffled beside her, her broken arm still wrapped in the dirty white cast, her frail body trembling under the gaze of 1,000 strangers. A suffocating silence fell over the cathedral. The music sputtered and died. Boniface's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He gripped the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned white. Nneka did not stop. She walked until she reached the very front of the altar. She looked at the wealthy crowd, her heart beating faster, but her voice was remarkably steady when she spoke. She told the congregation that she would not marry a monster. She raised the old woman's broken arm for everyone to see. She described the dark basement, the starvation, and the cruel beatings. She told them how Boniface paraded his wealth in public while torturing the woman who gave him life in private. She declared that true wealth was measured not in gold, but in the kindness we show to others, and that Boniface possessed a soul poorer than the lowest beggar in the streets. The cathedral erupted into chaotic whispers. Boniface snapped. The veins in his neck pulsed with suppressed rage. He screamed at his private security guards standing near the exits. He ordered them to lock the heavy cathedral doors. He commanded them to drag the ungrateful village rat and the crazy old woman to the basement, promising to bury them both alive. The guards drew their weapons and began to march down the aisle. Nneka pulled the old woman behind her, shielding her with her own body. She closed her eyes, ready to accept the terrible cost of her bravery. Then came a sound like thunder. The locked cathedral doors did not just open. They burst inward with a deafening crash. The crippled beggar from the market stood in the doorway. He stepped forward. He did not use his wooden staff. He threw the stick onto the marble floor. It clattered loudly in the silent room. He took another step. He was not limping anymore. He walked with long, powerful strides. He reached up. He pulled off the dirty, matted wig. He wiped the thick layer of grime from his face. He stood completely straight. He was tall, imposing, and radiant with quiet authority. The guards froze in their tracks. He looked at Boniface. He spoke with the voice of a king. "My name is Obina. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Zenith Global Industries." The chain reaction of shock was instantaneous. The wealthy guests gasped, recognizing the name of the most reclusive, powerful billionaire on the continent. The politicians shifted nervously in their seats. Boniface froze completely, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. The arrogant sneer melted away into absolute terror. Nneka opened her eyes, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the handsome, commanding man before her, recognizing those sharp brown eyes that had looked up at her from the market mud. Obina continued, his words striking like lightning. "You called me filth. You kicked my bowl. You told this brave woman she belonged in the dirt, but you are the one standing on a crumbling foundation. I own the bank that finances your loans. I own the shipping lines you use for your smuggling. As of 1 hour ago, every contract you hold has been canceled. Your accounts are frozen, your mansion is seized, you are nothing." Boniface collapsed. His knees hit the marble floor with a heavy thud. He held out his shaking hands. He wept like a child. He begged for mercy. He promised he would change. Obina did not even look at him. He snapped his fingers. Uniformed police officers swarmed into the cathedral from the side doors. They grabbed Boniface roughly by his tailored lapels. They clamped heavy iron handcuffs onto his wrists. They dragged the weeping, broken tyrant down the aisle, his desperate cries echoing against the high ceilings until the doors slammed shut behind him. The storm was over. The monster was gone. Obina walked gently up the steps of the altar. The intimidating power in his eyes softened as he looked at Nneka. He reached out and gently touched her tear-stained cheek. He told her that for 6 months, he had searched for a heart that was not corrupted by greed. He said she was invisible to the cruel world, but she had been fully seen by him. He told her that when she gave away her last piece of food to a broken stranger, she had saved his faith in humanity. He knelt before the orphan girl in the torn dress, right there on the altar, and asked if she would allow him to spend the rest of his life protecting her and the gentle mother she had saved. Nneka looked at the man who had disguised himself to find the truth. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of pure, overwhelming joy. She nodded, pulling him up from his knees, and the entire cathedral erupted into deafening applause. Later that afternoon, a sleek private jet soared above the clouds, carrying Nneka, the recovering old woman, and Obinna toward a new life of peace and unimaginable security. The orphan who had been sold for nothing was now the queen of an empire, surrounded by love that was simple but real. This story teaches us that true kindness is never wasted. The universe has a way of rewarding those who give from the heart, even when they have nothing left to give. Success reveals character, but adversity proves it. When we treat the lowest among us with dignity, we open the doors to our own greatest blessings. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe so you do not miss more powerful stories like this one. Share it with your friends and family to spread the wisdom and lessons of traditional African storytelling.